Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another episode of this Redux course. In the previous episode we talked about middleware. The middleware is a function that you can plug in into Redux flow. We saw middleware with vanilla Redux, let me use this term, and with Redux toolkit. Now, in this episode, we will talk about asynchronous actions. At first, it's not so straightforward to make asynchronous actions, asynchronous calls in Redux. And by asynchronous action, we mean all those actions, all those operations that could take some time to run, to complete. Think, for example, of an API call. We will see a quick reintroduction to API calls with fetch in a moment. If you read the Redux documentation or if you followed the previous episode, you should know that there are many building blocks in Redux. The reducer is a function and must stay pure. No side effects are allowed to run in the reducer. For side effects, we mean even a call to console log, because this call will touch an external system, and that will be the console in this case. You cannot make API calls with fetch, for example, so the reducer is not the right place for asynchronous action and for side effects. Then there is the middleware. We will see in one of the next episodes that the middleware can be used for making asynchronous actions, asynchronous call. But in the meantime, let's focus on action creators. Could action creators be used for asynchronous calls? Maybe. We don't know yet, but since they are just synchronous functions and must return just an object, and this object is the Redux action, we don't know yet if it is possible to use an action creator for API calls. So these are the building blocks of Redux. Of course, you can make an API call inside an event listener in JavaScript, for example, but since we want to abstract all this business logic to Redux and have a clean interface, we need to ask ourselves where to put these asynchronous actions. Let's rename this file, because in this index.js we'll create another index.js from scratch, and that will be our new playground. Now, in this tutorial we will use fetch, which was introduced in ECMAScript 2015. You may know that fetch is based on promises. So in the first, then you can access response, and you can also get back the JSON that you could access in the second. Then, of course, since it is based on promises, you can catch any eventual error. For now, let's focus on then. Now, let's think about Redux. Let's think about what is the flow that we must implement in Redux when working with asynchronous calls. First thing first, when you make an API call in Redux, you could dispatch an action. Let's say we want to fetch articles from an API. We can dispatch fetch articles like so. Now, if the response is not okay, you will get back a response object with a property named OK. If that property is true, that means the API call succeeded. If the property is false, that means the API errored out, and you will get access to response.status and response.status text. That means when working in Redux, we can dispatch another action. It could be still fetch article, but this time with a payload. So the payload in this case will be a response.status. The status could be 400, for example, or could be also 403. That stands for forbidden. If the response instead is good, response.json. That will give you back the JSON payload, and in that case you will dispatch another or still the same action, or it is fetch articles in reality. You can dispatch the same action, this time with the JSON payload. Let's fix fetch articles here too. So you could dispatch articles with the JSON payload. So this is the actual flow that we will implement in Redux. Let's illustrate things out with an actual example. So since this is a Webpack project, I have already installed Redux. Let's remove this code, and we will create a store with create store. We will also use combine reducer because I want to show you how to split your reducers. And while we're there, let's also import apply middleware. Now let's think about an initial state. Const articles state. The state could have a property named as fetching. For now, could be just an empty string. Then it could have a property named error. That for now is empty too. And then we've got articles that could be an array of articles. Now let's create also a reducer. It could be articles reducer. It takes, as usual, a state, that will be article state, and the action. For now, let's just return the state. We will see later what kind of actions we need to handle. Let's also declare middleware array. You will see later why we need this. And let's create the store with create store. Create store takes a root reducer, but this time we'll use combine reducer. Root reducer could be the result of calling combine reducer with an object with a mapping between properties. In this case, we want to have a slice of state called articles and your actual reducer, article reducer. Here we go. And here we got the reducer. We also need to pass apply middleware. Apply middleware is a function which could take a spread of our array middleware. Now let's see, we've got in this interface a simple button, so we could register an event listener for this button. Const button equal document dot get element by id. It is my button, and when this button is clicked, we could fetch something from an API. And that means, since we have no action creators still, we'll create one in a moment. That means we can dispatch something, and that something could be fetch articles. So fetch article. Let's create this action creator here, function fetch articles. It could take a payload, and here we can return an object type fetch articles. Let's declare also this named action here, const fetch articles equal fetch articles. Okay, so we've got the initial state, the articles reducer, we've got an array of middleware still empty, we've got the reducer, which is the result of calling combine reducer with our articles reducer. We've also got these action creators. Let's see how it looks like in our interface. So this is a Webpack project, so calling npm start should launch my page. Here we go. Now let's open up the console. We have this button here. Still no asynchronous call to the API. Let's create also a middleware, logger middleware, just for recalling the theory. The middleware takes to as a parameter and must return a first function which takes next as a parameter and must return a second function which takes action as a parameter. Let's log the action here just to confirm that we are dispatching the action, and also let's not forget to call next action. This logger middleware can be provided to this array here, logger middleware. Here it is, button, click me, and indeed we can see that we are dispatching fetch articles. Now let's get into asynchronous calls. Again, let's think about it. The reducer is a pure function, so you cannot call an API there. You cannot even console log something. The middleware could be something that could be used for asynchronous actions, but for now let's pretend that we don't have any middleware. How about action creators instead? It is possible to call fetch inside an action creator with Redux. Let's give it a shot. Let's remove this object for now, and we will call fetch with our URL. As soon as we make the call, here, of course, we can access to the response, but as soon as we make the call, we can dispatch something. Without creating an action creator, let's use objects for now. We can dispatch as is fetching, for example, and if the response errors out, that means we check response.ok. If the response errors out, we dispatch something else, which is to.dispatch. That could be API errored, for example, with a payload that is the response.status. The status will vary depending on if you've got a forbidden or not authorized. If instead the response is good, we return response.json. Once we've got JSON, we can chain another then here, and we will have access to the JSON payload. Again, here we can dispatch another action, this time of type as fetched, for example, with the actual payload that will be the JSON. Now, this is the rough theory of this asynchronous flow. Let's see what happens if I try this code in the browser. Let's click here, click me, and we get this error. Actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async actions. What does it mean? Redux on its own cannot handle asynchronous actions. That means if you want to call an API, either you create your own middleware, and we will see how to do that in one of the next lessons, or instead you can use custom middleware named redux-thunk. Redux-thunk must be installed. Let's stop this webpack, npm redux-thunk. So you install this redux-thunk, which is a custom middleware. Now, once you've got thunk installed, you can import thunk here. Import thunk from redux-thunk, and since thunk is a middleware, you can place the middleware here, thunk. This way, thunk will be injected in the middleware chain in Redux. Now, what thunk makes possible is that instead of returning objects from Redux actions, you can return a function. This outer function will have access to dispatch. That means you could dispatch actions in the store. At this point, the thunk can return a promise. So we can remove this store dot here, store dot here, and store dot here. The code will look a bit cleaner. Let me enlarge this window. The code will look a bit cleaner, and you will have access to dispatch inside the action creator. And this will become an asynchronous action creator. So we've got a fetch call here. If the response is not okay, we dispatch an API errored action with the response status. If the response instead is good, we dispatch as fetched action with the actual payload. Now, if you're curious about the best practice for handling asynchronous actions in Redux with the corresponding actions, you can check out this documentation on Redux, and you will see handle all this type of actions in your application. Or, for example, you can have a single action named fetch something with the actual payload, or you could also have many actions depending on what you want to do. Now, in one of the next lessons, we will say create async-thunk, which is part of Redux Toolkit, and it is the actual recommended way for asynchronous actions in Redux. Anyway, you must know that this method of dispatching asynchronous actions through action creators does exist still in Redux. Older code bases still use this approach. Now let's give it a shot in the browser. So don't forget to install redux-thunk and to import the library. Let's open up again this page, and with a console open it, let's see what happens. I don't know if everything will work out of the box, but we will fix in a moment. Click me. Here we go. So it looks like it is working. Yes, so we've got this type is fetching action here, which is this dispatch here. So when the API call is about to start, we say to the store, hey, I'm going to make an API call, so keep an eye on this. When the response is fine, we've got this as fetched action with the actual payload. In fact, if we look at this payload here, we can see that as 200 elements. Let's try here with this URL. If I click here, I can see that action now is API errored and the payload is 400. So we outlined how to work with asynchronous actions in Redux. With redux-thunk, which is a custom middleware, you can dispatch not only objects, so not only plain objects, but also asynchronous call. There is still this new API create async-thunk, and we will take a look at this later. Another way to dispatch asynchronous actions, to make asynchronous calls in Redux, is with your own custom middleware. As an exercise, try to move this logic inside your own middleware. So what else can we say? Oh, let's handle this logic inside the reducer. We will just handle this as fetched, which is the happy path of this application inside the reducer. What we're going to do is to subscribe here, store.subscribe, which takes a callback, which takes a function. Let's, for now, just log the state to the console. That way we will see the actual payload in the console. So let's handle this branch. So when the action type is as fetched. That means the API succeeded. What's going on with this? Copy paste as fetched. Case as fetched. Do you remember what we need to do inside the reducer to update the state? We need to return a new object. You can do this either with object.assign or a more cleaner approach with the spread, with the object spread operator. So first you spread the initial state inside the object, and then you update whatever property you need to update. In this case it is articles. Now, since we need to pay attention to the immutability of the Redux, so articles should not be simply mutated like so. What you want to do instead is take the original articles and concatenate with concat the actual payload, so action payload. Here we go. Let's see. So we've got this reducer with the case as fetched. As an exercise, you could also handle is fetching or API errored, for example, and you can show something to the user when the API errors out. Now, let's try here in the console. Let's click on this button. So we can still see, oh, because we need to give the application a valid URL, not an API that errors out. Here it is. So instead of calling this API, we need to call this one. Okay, let's try again. Click me. Okay, now it looks good. We have this is fetching, and pay attention that these objects are logged by our middleware because we injected this logger middleware here. So we've got this is fetching, which is this action dispatch here. Then we've got this articles, which is the first update to the state, but at that point the state was still empty. Then we've got this as fetched with the actual payload, and as fetched comes from this dispatch. And here we've got the actual state of the application with the articles array here full of articles from the API. As you can see, combine reducer gives you a slice of the state with the name of the property that you choose here in the object mapping. So we handle this as fetched close. So this is the theory behind asynchronous actions in Redux with redux-thunk. As an exercise, try to implement your own custom middleware for asynchronous calls. That could be API middleware, for example. In the next lessons, we will see create async-thunk, which is the new and recommended way for asynchronous actions in Redux. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for new episodes. If you have any question or any feedback, feel free to comment below. See you later.